are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, but today's case is going to be on the Bricca family murders. Now this case has multiple connections to different people and different cases, but there has been 0 overall arrests in this case, and it is still unsolved today, even though it seems like it should be a simple open and shut case. For those of you who did request this after my Valerie Piercy case, I want to thank you, and this one is for you. If you haven't watched that yet, it does come into play later on in this case, so you can either watch that one before or after this case. By the way, I post so much true crime content like this, and if you do enjoy these type of stories and hearing about these victims, then please make sure to go ahead and subscribe down below. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1966 in Green Township, Ohio, and there lived a beautiful family called the Briccas. There was 28-year-old Jeremy Bricca, who was the father of the family, 23-year-old Linda Bricca, who he was married to, and their daughter, 4-year-old Debbie. At this point, the Bricca family was pretty new in town, and they actually had moved there from the West Coast because Jeremy had gotten a job at the Monsanto plant of agricultural services. And Linda, his wife, had been a stewardess for all this time, or a flight attendant, and when she moved there, she actually got a job at the Glenway Animal Hospital as like a veterinarian tech. When they moved into this new home, the neighbors would describe them as a pretty quiet, to themselves family. They were pretty much the youngest in the neighborhood at this time, but their daughter was the complete joy of the neighborhood. She had a beautiful personality and a sparkling smile, and everybody who came in contact with little Debbie absolutely loved her. And that is how most of the neighborhood knew of the Briccas, was because Debbie would get her parents out and about, talking to people, going on play dates, and many other things. But on September 27th of 1966, everyone knew that something was wrong at the Bricca household. Their neighbors Richard Meyer and Jerry Jansen headed over at about 10 p.m. that evening to go check on them because they had realized that Jerry hadn't been at work for 2 days, which was very, very unusual for him. And so they went and they were going to knock on the door when they realized the door was unlocked. Now, the doors and windows at this time in houses were kept unlocked. Nobody really thought that anybody was going to come in, or there was a danger at all to having a home that was open to the public. And so a lot of people did keep these unlocked. So they didn't think much of this, and they kind of stepped inside. And that is when Richard stopped, because he noticed the horrible stench that he recognized so very clearly. And he recognized this stench because he had once been at war in World War II, and it was the stench of death. He walked out of that house in tears and called the police. Now, these 2 men really went over, not only because Jerry had been out of work, but also because their 2 dogs, Thumper and Dusty, had been barking continuously for these 2 days, and they couldn't understand why. And with them not being able to see the Briccas to talk to them about it, they thought it was best that they head over and check it out themselves. When the police got there, they found all the members of the Bricca family deceased in their own beds. Linda, who was in her sleeping gown, was stabbed 8 times, 6 in the chest and 2 in the head. Jerry was stabbed 9 times, 4 in the back, 3 in the neck, and 2 in the head. Debbie, also in her nightgown, had been stabbed 4 times in the back, with each stab going all the way through her little body. And yet none of the neighbors had heard a sound of this happening, and they were only approximately 15 feet away. You see, they had been killed 2 days prior on September 25th, and it was a seemingly peaceful day for the Bricca family. It was a Sunday, so they went to the Catholic church for Mass at about 10 a.m. and they were all there, bright and bushy-tailed and ready to attend. They left at about noon, and that is when Jerry and Linda would go their separate ways. Linda would take Debbie home to give her lunch and finish everything for Sunday and just relax and have a nice day, whereas Jerry would go to work because he was trying to get a promotion at his job to get them more money, and he figured the best way to do that was to show that he was willing to work overtime, and so he would go in on the weekends sometime to work for a little bit to get ahead of everybody. He would leave the plant at about 8 p.m. that evening to head home, and he would stop by a grocery store to grab some milk before going all the way home. When he got home, he took the trash out to the curb where he saw a neighbor walking her dog. And they exchanged a few words. It was just normal, casual conversation. And that would be the last time anyone would see the Bricca family alive. Like I said, the Bricca family was about the youngest family in the neighborhood. And so the rest of the neighbors thought that it was almost their responsibility to look after them, kind of like parents, grandparents just wanting to look after their kids. They kind of had that same feel for the Bricca family. And so when all these things started adding up, they really were aware of what was going on. They noticed that Linda hadn't been out in her garden for the past 2 days. They noticed Debbie hadn't been out to play. The newspaper hadn't been picked up. They were a very close-knit community. And so the last straw really was the dogs barking that got them to go over there. When the police arrived at the scene, they actually asked the 2 neighbors who had walked in and smelled that horrible stench to help identify their bodies, because their relatives, the Bricca's relatives, weren't really responding to their calls. They couldn't get a hold of anybody, and they thought that the neighbors would be the quickest possible way to identify their bodies. Investigators believe that this attacker had come in through the basement window and led Jerry and Linda to their bedroom from the living room where they were. Debbie was already in her bed at this time for bedtime, and once this attacker got this couple into their bedroom, they found Jerry with a sock in his mouth and also a piece of medical tape on his chin that was just kind of hanging there. Jerry and Linda were found on top of each other in their bed with marks on their wrist, indicating that they possibly were tied up. Now, the stab wound showed that this attacker was possibly left-handed and that it was a carving knife from their own kitchen. After a super long search for this knife, the murder weapon was not found, but they did find the dogs who were barking consistently, who got the neighbors to go to the house, in the basement, locked downstairs, and appeared to have been sedated. After this, a huge investigation began with about 300 people around the country being interrogated. They had fingerprints, hair, and fluid samples from this crime scene, and yet the technology at the time was not up to par with where they needed it to be. In fact, really the only thing that could help them was the fingerprints if it was an exact match. It didn't appear to be a robbery, although the house had been ransacked. It didn't appear that anything had been stolen. And they really leaned away from robbery because they believed that no robber would take the time to go and put the dogs away and sedate them. Then, after autopsies were done on the family, it appeared that Linda had been sexually active right before her death, but it didn't appear forced, and so investigators believed it could have been her husband and not the attacker. Then, going into more of the dog theory, looking more into where the dogs were, because that was a huge component in this case, having dogs locked up and sedated. And they began to think, who would have medicine to do this? Who would be able to sedate dogs? Now, of course, you can do this by many different ways, but who would be most likely to know about this and how to do it? A vet. And didn't Linda Bricca work at a veterinary clinic? 38-year-old Fred Linenger was Linda's boss at this time, and when he was interviewed, he told investigators very little information, but there were already so many rumors that implicated him in these murders, being the killer. You see, around town, people had really started gossiping before they even were murdered that Linda was having an affair on her husband with another man. They had seen Linda allegedly at a lover's lane where you would go and park with a significant other, and they saw Linda there with another man who wasn't her husband, and many speculated that it was her boss. So, did that mean that these murders were a crime of passion? Fred never had an alibi for that night and immediately hired a lawyer, saying he was feeling threatened by investigators even though he was never under arrest. And unfortunately, when investigators tried to fire back and get him to come in for more questioning, his lawyer actually fired back with something that made it pretty much impossible to interrogate him again. And that was the fact that the Miranda law, the Miranda rights that we all know so well, that police have to say to you to make sure you know that you don't have to say anything. And this had just come into effect at the time that Fred was investigated the first time. And they had not read him those rights because it was so new, and I'm sure, it was hard to implement them at first, like it is for anything. But since they had not done this lawyer said that Fred refused to have any more questioning done, and they pretty much had their backs up against a wall. And of course, with Fred out of the investigation, investigators had to focus on something else to possibly look into, even though they would rather focus on Fred. So when they were looking over neighbors' statements, they found that a lot of them believed that it was a hitman that killed the family. And in fact, one neighbor in particular who knew the Briccas the best, it was believed, was a woman named Nettie, who would go on play dates with Linda Bricca and Debbie and would talk to her just occasionally. They weren't super close, but Linda did confide some things in her. And Nettie said a few weeks prior to their murder, Linda became very paranoid and uncomfortable, and instead of letting Debbie walk home from the play date, she would go and pick her up. And when Nettie kind of asked her what was going on, all Linda really said was that she had once helped break up a drug gang, and it wasn't sure if this was connected to the paranoia or just the fact that she wanted to get that off of her chest, but this is what Nettie said. She had said, and she remembered it because it was such an outlandish claim that she didn't even know if it was true or not at the time. So was this a premeditated revenge plot for breaking up this gang? Well, one of the neighbors who actually found the Briccas believed that that was the case. But even though investigators had concluded that this was a very smart, experienced killer, they still had zero theories as to who it could be. But there had been a serial killer in the area of Cincinnati within this time period, and their name was the Cincinnati Strangler. You see, 9 months prior to this murder, on December 2nd of 1965, a 56-year-old woman named Emma Jean Harrington was found in her apartment's basement bathroom, sexually assaulted and strangled with a nylon cord. Then 4 months later, a 58-year-old Lois Daint was found in her apartment, strangled with her own stockings. 2 months later, that June, Janet Messier was found strangled with a necktie in a park 2 blocks away from her home. Then 2 months later, on August 14th, a 31-year-old Barbara Bowman was found with multiple stab wounds and strangled after taking a cab home. This cab was later found abandoned with her purse inside, as well as blood and a rope. Then on October 12th, a 58-year-old named Alice Hockhauser was found strangled and sexually assaulted, and she had been actually attacked in her own driveway and strangled with a belt. She was also bludgeoned as well. 6 days later, 81-year-old Rose Winstill was found sexually assaulted and strangled with an electrical cord. Then on December 9th, 81-year-old Layla Carlick was found strangled with her stockings as well. But that is not the only thing that happened on December 9th in this case, because they had found evidence on who this could possibly be based on that very cab that they had found next to Barbara Bowman's body. You see, evidence found in this cab led to the identity of the Cincinnati Strangler, who was believed to be 56-year-old Postel Lasky Jr., who was a former cab driver. He was apprehended on December in 1966, and he was actually arrested and got the death penalty for Barbara Bowman's murder. Now, he did not confess to this murder or to any of the others. These murders that I talked about previously were all connected through MOs, but they couldn't give any evidence to connect them, which is why he was never charged with any of the other murders. But it leads you to believe, were there more victims on the Cincinnati Strangler's list? Because the murder stopped after he was locked away. Could Pastel Lasky Jr. have killed another 3, the Bricca family? He would have been free at the time of the Bricca murders. He wasn't arrested until December. Their murders were in September. But the Bricca family murders did seem like such a personal crime. The violence in it, the putting the dogs away, using their own kitchen knife, and investigators weren't sure that Pastel Lasky Jr. had any sort of vendetta against them, and to go from just doing 1 person at a time to 3 made it a little iffy. And the Briccas hadn't been strangled like the other victims, but the reason they almost connected it was because Pastel was actually moving on to different means of murder. He had gone on to strangling and bludgeoning and stabbing in his later victims. That's why they believed that he could possibly be involved in this, and also the fact that he had sexually assaulted his victims, and they hadn't completely ruled out that Linda hadn't been sexually assaulted. I mean, maybe Pastel had seen Linda somewhere and thought that she was alone, and so when he went in to kill her, realized she had a whole family and had to do something with everyone once he got there. The level of violence with his crimes were increasing with each victim. But the investigators in the Pastel Lasky case of the Cincinnati Strangler couldn't even connect him to those murders or the murder he had been convicted of. They connected him to that, obviously because of evidence, but not because he confessed. So they had very little chance that he would actually confess to the Bricca murders, and he never did. Another theory was one that we talked about in a previous case, and that was that possibly the Bricca murders were connected to another murder involving a young woman named Valerie Piercy in Kenilworth, Illinois. Now you may be thinking, okay, Illinois is quite a ways away from Ohio. Yes, but Linda did grow up in a very upper class family in Illinois, and she circled around the same kind of people as the Percys, Valerie Piercy, and even went to high school with Valerie at one point. Could this have been where she broke up this gang? Could her and Valerie have possibly done that together, and their murders have been revenge years later? Was Linda super paranoid, like Nettie said, because she was afraid they would find her in Ohio after Valerie had been murdered, and then after that week she realized that they could be coming for her? I mean, they were only 2 years apart, which means they could have hung out a lot together, been around the same places, the same people, and ultimately had the same tragic ending. But another theory is that the Cincinnati Strangler wasn't the only serial killer possibly involved in this case, and there was an actual connection found to another serial killer, to Linda Bricca. And this one may surprise you. You see, 4 months before the Bricca murders, on June 23rd, a Lonnie Trumbull and Lisa Wick had both been attacked as they slept in their apartment. Lonnie had been bludgeoned and strangled, and Lisa fortunately survived. These 2 women were flight attendants who had worked with Linda Bricca and had at one point lived with her. And they were both attacked by the infamous Ted Bundy. That's right, Ted Bundy. And so many speculated maybe Ted Bundy was the one who killed the Briccas. Ted Bundy would have been 19 at the time. He was working in Washington, and would he have traveled at 19 years old all the way from Washington to Ohio just to kill Linda Bricca and her family? And Ted Bundy also wasn't known to use a knife, and the Briccas were murdered with a knife. But was this murder, was the murder of her friends, the reason why she was paranoid instead of Valerie's murder? I mean, it could have been a combination of both, and just because her friends were being murdered and not because she felt she had a connection to them. But with all of these theories, this case has never been solved, and in 1990 they could actually test the Cincinnati Strangler to the crime scene of the Briccas and officially rule him out as a suspect. Then in 2014, Linda Bricca's boss, Fred Linenger, and his wife both committed suicide. Now it seems a bit fishy, the fact that they both did at the same time. It was speculated maybe he felt a lot of guilt for what he had done in the past, but they had both committed suicide, and so there's no longer that suspect to talk to in this case either. And unfortunately, there was a box of evidence that wasn't properly preserved in this case and has degraded, and so it has made this case even harder to continue investigating. But allegedly they had found that the tape on Jerry Bricca's face matched either medical tape or veterinarian tape. Take that as you will, but who do you believe killed the Bricca family? I want to say Fred Linenger. Most of the other theories presented are so far-fetched compared to his. Because yes, the two flight attendants that knew Linda and Valerie, they were both murdered around the same time, and so their cases were kind of linked and connected and kind of thrown all together, which I think ultimately hindered this case of the Briccas, because they were looking at possible outer connections instead of right in the certain place that Linda's had happened. These girls were both so far away in their crimes, and back in this time, windows and doors, like I said, were left open. People were so innocent and thinking that nothing happened, that no bad things would come to them, that there weren't bad people. And so they not invited people in, but they weren't cautious about what they were doing about if people were following, about locking their doors like we are today. And so I think that those were just coincidentally all happened to girls who knew each other, but not because they knew each other. Because I think that if they didn't know each other, these cases wouldn't even be looked into as connected. I think it was just because they had that relation that people were speculative about it. I believe that Fred's behavior told a lot about his character during this investigation. Even if it is just an employee and you didn't really know them that well, you would still want to help in any way you can to solve their murder. And the fact that he was so hesitant about even talking, that he didn't want to say anything at all that could help them, and then immediately got a lawyer, says a lot. And I think that if this lawyer hadn't been so good at his job, this case may have a solved stamp on it today instead of still being opened. However, could they have jumped to conclusions because of these rumors and arrested the wrong man, and this could have all just been a rumor against Fred? That is a possibility too, but one that they never really got to investigate further. But even though this case is so old, there are still people out there that could possibly know something, and it's been so long now that they may feel it's okay to come forward, and that is all we need is one person. So if you have any information, please call the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office at 513-851-6000. And I want to thank the Unsolved Murders podcast, where I got a lot of this information from, because old cases are very hard to find information on, so when you do find someone who has put in so much effort in looking into the case, I definitely do want to thank them with the research. But don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.